Hey all, Orthior here. Today we're going to be looking at Game 1 of the RBY match in the World Cup Finals from 2019. We've got Rozes representing US West, playing under the alt Kaladin. Solid Stormlight Archives reference, I appreciate it. And they're versing Hantsuki from Brazil, playing under the alt Saves Xmas. So on to the teams. Rose's team consists of Lead Jinx, Snorlax, Executor, Chansey, Zapdos and Tauros, whereas Hantsuki is running Lead Gengar, Victory Bell, Tauros, Snorlax, Chansey, and Starmie. So, I mean, Rose's team, not a lot to say about it. It is super standard. You just cover all your bases really well. Zapdos is a really big threat. Jinx is nice in that, you get an early sleep, ideally. Hantsuki is running a bit more of an interesting team. They're obviously deviating from the Big Four formula by running Victory Bell over Executor. So with that choice, you are losing a lot of defensive utility, but you are gaining a threat it's more of a consistent offensive contributor. It's like Executor, it tends to be kind of, you get sleep off and then it sponges damage and it blows up and not a lot else, whereas Victory Bell is much more dynamic. It can damage with Razor Leaf, it can earn free switches with Wrap, it can also spread paralysis. And it's also a versatile threat. It can run two very distinct sets being Dual Status and Swords Dance. So there's an element of versatility. It's also something of a trend lately that high-level players have been dropping Executor, and Victory Bell has also surged in popularity. So it's not too surprising that we see it in Finals of World Cup. I mean, when I say Executor's dropped in popularity, it's still run on the overwhelming majority of teams, but it's like 75-80% as opposed to like 90%. So with Victory Bell being a relative loss of defensive utility compared to Egg, Starmie makes a lot of sense in that it gives you very broad kind of defensive coverage. It's effective against rocks, it's effective against other water types, so it can sponge blizzards, that kind of thing. Overall a really solid option. Last thing to point out is Lead Gengar. Gengar is not a common lead because it's prone to bad matchups, and because Starmie and Alakazam, they're everywhere in the lead position and they really shut it down and it can't really do much if it gets those matchups. That's not the case here. Lead Jinx is absolutely a favourable matchup for Gengar, and in a favourable matchup it can actually really do a lot of work. It's just that's not that common. I mean, Jinx is common, but Starmie and Alakazam are combined to easily account for more usage. Won't comment too much further since Hantsuki actually has a really cool gimmick in mind with the Gengar, so we'll get to that later. As far as the matchup goes, Hantsuki, again, you've got the Gengar with a favourable matchup, but Rose's Zapdos, man, it can absolutely demolish Hantsuki's team. Like, Victory Bell and Starmie are both weak to it. Snorlax and Chansey, they're not bad, but, I mean, Zapdos, it can easily threaten both of them. Like, it's really threatening, and unfortunately for Hantsuki, that fifth slot matters a lot more than the lead position does. Lead position tends to be much more limited in impact, even though, like, we talk about it a lot, but it's a specialized role, whereas fifth slot has much greater opportunity to impact a game. So I'd definitely give the edge to Roses in terms of matchup. And yeah, so let's start the battle. And turn 1, Explosion, Gengar. Yes. So this is the gimmick I was talking about. It's a really cool gimmick in that, like, the premise is that you would blow up. The opponent's probably going to send in Executor following their Jinx dying, and you would then send in something faster that can sleep the Executor, in this case, Victory Bell. It's definitely a really cool gimmick. Like, you're giving up a really good matchup and hopefully getting a better one. So you do need to make sure it's worth it, but also it is a really cool gimmick in that even at the highest level, people don't expect it. It's extremely rare. This is only the third time I've ever seen it used. The other time was by myself, and the time before that was the first time I'd ever seen it, and I thought, hey, that's a cool idea. But anyway, it is still a gimmick though. If people expect it, then it can easily backfire. So yeah, following the explosion, Victory Bell comes in, Executor comes in. Executor takes the sleep from Victory Bell, and Victory Bell is going to go for the Stun Spore, predicting a switch. Now, Rozes Executor is just not as valuable as the rest of as anything else on Rozes' team. Like Snorlax, Chansey, Tauros, you're never going to absorb sleep with them. Zapdos isn't as valuable as the normals, but it's still like a massive threat and much more consistent than any sleep that Executor is going to provide. So it does suck for Rozes that they can't get their own sleep off, but it's probably the least terrible option they've got. And Stun Spore, that's obviously predicting a switch. Normally you wouldn't want to leave a sleeping Pokemon in. However, Rozes is clearly okay with taking the risk and potentially letting in a Tauros, because like it's early in the game, they haven't spent a lot of resources, so they're probably thinking that can handle one Tauros switch in or something, and this way they're not exposing the rest of their team to status damage and all the rest of what Victory Bell has to offer. On top of that, it's not unreasonable to predict that Hantsuki would not go to Tauros, because to get the most out of Victory Bell, you have to be kind of leaving it in, kind of spreading status as much as possible, getting damage off, doing all that kind of thing. It's not something where you like send it in, get sleep, switch it immediately back out, because then you're not getting value, because its defensive utility isn't that great, so it needs to be actually doing stuff offensively to get value. Anyway, once the Stun Spore misses, Hantsuki goes for the Wrap. It's kind of a middle-of-the-road option in that, you're getting a little bit of damage off an Executor, but you're also covering a potential switch in. Because obviously then you would be able to switch out to a check for free if they switch into your Wrap. But it does allow Executor to wake, and Hantsuki's just going to put them right back to sleep. Another thing to consider is that it's not just about exploiting a sleeping opponent, it's also about shutting them down, preventing them from landing their own sleep. So anyway, Sleep Powder again predicts the switch with Stun Spore, and it doesn't work, then goes for the Razor Leaf. This is interesting because the reason Hantsuki wouldn't just switch out to Tauros here is because by the time you've done that, that's 3 sleep turns burnt by the Executor. There's a decent chance it would wake, and that's obviously disastrous if you can't put it back to sleep again. But by going for the Razor Leaf, Hantsuki is signaling to his opponent that, I see what you're doing, you're staying in with Executor, I'm going to deal as much damage as possible, and then I'll just put you back to sleep when you wake up. So now that Hantsuki has switched on to what Rozes intends to do, it's up to Rozes to kind of respond to that, and they have a really strong response. As it turns out, Zapdos comes in for free on Razor Leaf, and that's obviously by far the most threatening response that Rozes could muster. It's a pretty damn good response. What is interesting though is that it is actually very risky from an information management standpoint. Normally with Zapdos, you want to kind of reserve it for later in the battle, because if you reveal it too early and the opponent has a hard counter, they'll adjust their play so that it's very difficult to circumvent that hard counter. But that's obviously not the case here. And Zapdos is immediately able to go to work, paralyzing the Chansey, and once that Chansey's paralyzed, straight out to Snorlax, because that's just what you do. Paralyzed Chansey, you send in Snorlax. Obviously Hantsuki's not going to stay in. They go to Reflect, and we have Reflect Lax Stalwart. Right. So obviously the goal here is to force the opposing Lax to rest, and then you would want to switch out to something that can threaten it while it's sleeping, and then force it out, and then ideally that thing would also be able to deal damage to the opposing team. But at the very least, you want to be able to force Lax out and be able to maintain pressure to stop it coming in and healing back up. As you can see, Rozes has a very clear plan for that. They've got Zapdos. Zapdos, obviously a huge threat, easily powerful enough to threaten Lax, and like Chansey is already paralyzed, and Zapdos already has a good matchup against Hantsuki's team. So yeah, that's a really big threat in this stall war. Hantsuki, not so much. Like, we've seen the Victory Bell. It would be nice, but it's not going to do a whole lot. We've already seen that Rozes can wall it. That leaves only the Starmie, which is... I mean, it depends on the set. If it's Blizzbolt, it actually lacks raw power, so it's conceivable that Lax could just stay in anyway. Either way, it's not going to get around the Chansey that Rozes has in the back, so it's not as damaging. So in this way, Rozes has a much better way of breaking the Reflect Lax stall wall than Hantsuki does, and we can see that here. Hantsuki is sticking to the Reflect Lax stall wall, whereas Rozes has the option of going to Zapdos to break through. And in this context, it's only a matter of time until Rozes actually manages to break through. Like, it's only a matter of time, which means it's actually even more important that Hantsuki doesn't stick to this stall war, because that Zapdos will destroy their team eventually. So you've got to do something here, whether it be, you might have to go to Starmie, even though it's not as threatening. Or maybe you make a more risky play and go to Starmie just before Lax Rest, say when it's around 50% HP. Then you could apply even more pressure. However, you're obviously risking a Paraslam that way. Anyway, Hantsuki, we're going to see, does not break out of this Reflect Lax stall war. And eventually, Zapdos is going to come in and absolutely wreak havoc. So Zapdos comes in on the resting Lax, gets the right prediction and a crit. So that's huge. That Zapdos is... That Chansey, is just absolutely destroyed by that. Hantsuki goes out to Starmie, which is a bit interesting. The Thunderbolt here is actually a really safe play from Rose's perspective, because that 16% on the Chansey, that's actually a minimum roll from Zapdos Thunderbolt, so it would have died. Maybe with a bare minimum roll, it could live with like 1 HP, but I doubt it. So Starmie, not the best switch in. However, it at least, it's safer than Victory Bell, because Victory Bell, if Rozes had predicted correctly, Victory Bell would just die, whereas Starmie, even though you don't get the right prediction, it's still able to come in, get off a Blizzard, and that'll put Zapdos into Hyper Beam range from Tauros. And that's exactly what Hantsuki goes for. Unfortunately, it doesn't really work out, because that Hyper Beam was super predictable. Rozes knows that their Zapdos is a huge threat. Hantsuki knows it. Everyone knows it. So it's obvious that Hantsuki is going to do whatever it takes to kill that Zapdos. And Rozes recognizes that, goes out to Lax. It's a pretty safe Hyper Beam from Hantsuki's perspective, because as you can see, Lax only barely survives it, sets up Reflect, and unfortunately for Hantsuki, their Lax is able to heal up. On the flip side, that does allow Hantsuki to heal up their own Chansey. So, I guess a bit of give and take, but overall, Rozes is easily emerging on top. And so we'll find ourselves back at this stall war situation. However, there's one really important difference here. Rozes knows what's on Hantsuki's team. And that's important, because we'll see now that Chansey comes in and it sets up Reflect. So what this means is that their Reflect Chansey has absolutely nothing to fear from Hantsuki's Snorlax. So it walls that, and then Rozes' Lax walls their Chansey. So, and Victory Bell struggles to come in. Tauros obviously can't really come in because it'll take damage and status and whatnot. So that leaves Snorlax and Chansey on Hantsuki's side to carry all the work, but as I mentioned, they get shut down hard. So again, Rozes holds all the cards. They can slowly maneuver towards bringing in their Zapdos or Tauros if that's what's necessary, but it's Zapdos that they'll end up bringing in. So eventually they forced Lax to rest. Hantsuki actually makes some really good plays. As soon as Lax rests, they switch out to Chansey, preempting a switch into either Zapdos or Tauros. Chansey would have been reasonable against either one. Obviously, you need Chansey for Zapdos because nothing else can really take it on. Tauros, not as good, but you can at least paralyze it. However, Rozes predicts that, just stays in, goes for the Seismic Toss. And then that leaves Hantsuki with a paralyzed Chansey in, with Rozes potentially having Snorlax. So they double back to Snorlax, and Rozes again predicts this. So Hantsuki's then made 2 aggressive switches, neither of which have paid off. So it's understandable that Lax would stay in here, but unfortunately, those aggressive plays were the right option. It's just that Rozes was able to be a step ahead. So yeah, now Rozes understands that, his opponent probably isn't going to want to again double switch, so they leave their Lax in. That's time to bring Zapdos in, and as we will see, gets another prediction with the Drill Peck, critical hit, and that's Chansey taking a ton of damage. Hantsuki follows that up with a switch out to Victory Bell, possibly hoping that Rozes would go for the Thunderbolt. Unfortunately, now that Rozes knows what's on Hantsuki's team, Thunderbolt doesn't really make sense. Drill Peck kind of covers everything, whereas Thunderbolt obviously lets in Victory Bell, so it doesn't make sense to go for Thunderbolt. Drill Peck, it provides the best coverage. And then after the Victory Bell switch in gets damaged, in comes Tauros. I disagree with both those plays. I would have sacrificed either Chansey or Victory Bell to bring in Tauros, because at this point, Rozes is at a massive advantage, and for Hantsuki, you're probably thinking, okay, maybe I need my Tauros to go on a rampage. And taking damage with Tauros is undermining the probability of that happening. So I don't agree at all with switching Tauros directly in. I would rather have sacrificed something. But anyway, so Tauros comes in. Obviously, Lax can switch straight in, so it doesn't go for the Hyper Beam. Body Slam, and they're just going to trade damage because Rozes knows Hantsuki's team, knows that Tauros is really their only major threat, and they're just happy to trade damage and trade the Lax for almost all of the Tauros's HP, and that then leaves their own Tauros to switch in. Hantsuki sacrifices the Victory Bell, and look, it's honestly just a sweep at this point. Hantsuki needed to land some sort of hacks on that Snorlax in order to win, and they just didn't get it. That left Rozes in a position where they had basically a clean sweep, and that's pretty much the game. So to kind of review things, I think the biggest thing was that Hantsuki didn't have a really detailed strategy for dealing with Reflect Stall Wars. Like, Rozes obviously had the Zapdos that could come in when the opportunity presented itself and deal just insane damage. Whereas Hantsuki, they were just sticking to the Stall War, which was playing right into Rozes' hands. So that was kind of the key failing. Obviously, Rozes had a really good matchup, and to be fair, Rozes did play really well. On a turn-by-turn basis, I don't think Hantsuki did too much wrong. Like, obviously, the opening, they didn't quite capitalize on the Victory Bell, but they didn't set themselves back either. Whereas, the only things that I can point out that, I think Hantsuki did wrong is responding to some of the Zapdos attacks. They let their Starmie take Thunderbolt. They didn't predict right with Victory Bell, that kind of thing. Hantsuki didn't have a lot of options there. And Rozes just, again, had a good matchup. They were able to play really well. So well played to both sides, but Rozes played really well. And that's it. So thanks for watching. I welcome any constructive criticism, because this is the first time I've made any sort of video like this. Don't know if I'll do it again, but hey, we'll see how it goes. Yeah, see ya.